And I'm going to turn it now over to Dr. Sarah Potts.
Great, thanks, Shannon. And thanks everybody for tuning in for the first Wednesday webinar of 2023. So as Shannon said, my name is Sarah Potts. I'm an extension specialist in dairy and beef production, and my office is actually located at the Western Research Center in Keedysville. And today we're going to be talking about benchmarking for the cow-calf herd. And this is a topic that's kind of near and dear to my heart because it involves collecting data and using data to make informed decisions, and that's something that resonates very well with me and my background and in research and things of that nature. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and get started. As Shannon said, if you have questions, just put them in the chat box, and we will take them as we go. So before we get too far into this, I just wanted to go over briefly about what is a benchmark. I pulled the definition of a benchmark from several different websites, and they all say pretty much the same thing, that a benchmark is just a standard that we can use to compare other measurements to, right? So to put that in context of what we're used to thinking of in terms of livestock production, the definition I came up with was that it's an objective, unbiased value that can be used to evaluate performance at the animal, herd, or farm level. Okay, so we can use it to compare animals to each other. We can use it to compare herds to each other, and make decisions.
I'm not sure I understand. Is there something else I can?
Well, so how can we use benchmarks? So I mentioned we can do it at the herd level as well as the animal level. So evaluating at the herd level using benchmarks can help us answer questions like, what is the current status of our herd performance? So where are we right now? Because if we don't know where we are, how can we know where we're going, or where we are in the path to where we're going? It can help us answer where our performance is compared to last year, as well as historically over time for the last 5 years. And we can also use benchmarks to identify areas where we could potentially improve. And then lastly, we can also use them to compare the performance of one herd to another. And I have an asterisk there because it's always important to remember that different herds have different constraints and different goals. So it's really important to keep that in mind when comparing one herd to another, and that not everybody has the same set of circumstances. So it's, just keep that in mind. In terms of the animal level and using benchmarks in that regard, it can be really helpful for figuring out how well certain animals are performing in your system. How do they compare with their cohorts? And that can help us really identify who the poor doers are and who might be a good candidate for culling. So if you have a cow that consistently calves really late in the calving season, and we'll talk about that here shortly, she might be one that you might consider putting on the cull list because she potentially has poor fertility. So that's just one example of how you could use that information or the data to tell you, who should stay and who should go. It can also help you kind of figure out what your future breeding decisions might need to be. If you have animals that are consistently not meeting the benchmark for growth, for example, perhaps you need a growthier bull to put on your cows, or maybe your cows aren't producing as much milk as you think they are. So that can help you kind of manage your mating decisions for the future to improve over time in those particular areas. So when we're talking about benchmarks and using data to improve our herd, obviously data collection is very essential to that process. We always like to use the adage, you can't manage what you don't measure, and that obviously applies when we're using benchmarks. So it's really important to get good data, because reliable, objective benchmarks can only be calculated from good data. So good data to me is data that's accurate, it's legible, it contains the necessary information that you need in order to calculate the benchmarks that you've decided you want to use, and it has to be accessible. So if it's in a locked office of one person and not everybody has access to it that needs access to it, that's not a good example of accessibility. So again, just remember when collecting data, garbage in, garbage out. So if you have poor data collection habits, you have a lot of error associated with your data collection, you're not going to get the most robust benchmarks and evaluations of animal performance or herd performance from that information. So good data collection is very, very important to getting good, reliable benchmarks. So I have kind of separated out some of the common benchmarks that we use in the cow-calf industry into three major categories: reproduction, health, and performance. And then lastly, we have another section that we have some benchmarks that can give us an overall snapshot of herd performance. And we'll talk about some indicators of performance in each of these areas in the next few slides. So starting off with our reproduction benchmarks, the first one I want to talk about is the length of calving season. And that is simply calculated based on the difference between the first calving and the last calving. So the number of days in between those two events. Now, I'm not saying that if you have a cow that you buy from the sale barn, you didn't know she was pregnant and she just calves randomly whenever. I'm not saying use that as your day of your first calving of the calving season. But I'm saying use, when you planned, when you had planned matings, when those first animals start calving, that is going to be the first day of your calving season. The reason why we look at length of calving season is obviously calvings that are closer together generates more uniform calves. So if you're somebody who's marketing calves, you're weaning either in the fall or in the spring, depending on when your calving season is, that gives you an opportunity to market those more uniform calves. It also helps you manage those calves more precisely, and you can wean them all at the same time. You can vaccinate them all at the same time. It makes things a lot easier in terms of management. It also helps with time management for you. We all know that calving season is a really busy time. We're running around, we're checking cows, making sure that everybody's doing well. So in terms of managing your time, reducing the number of days that you have to be running all over the place can be very helpful. So I know that some folks in our region in particular do market their products directly to the consumer, and a lot of times that requires them to have a steady flow of animals ready throughout the season. So they might not have a clearly defined calving season, but this is just one thing that we like to look at in terms of reproductive benchmarks. Pregnancy rate is another big one, and this is calculated by dividing the number of females confirmed pregnant by the number of females exposed for breeding. So everybody who gets put in the field with the bull is considered exposed for breeding. It can reflect reproductive efficiency for both cows and heifers, but also for the bulls. A poor pregnancy rate can be caused by a lot of different things. It can be related to poor fertility in the female. So if she has poor nutrition, poor health, she's got low body condition, so she's not as fertile going into that breeding season. She's not cycling. Those are all things that go into a pregnancy rate. So a poor pregnancy rate can indicate issues in those particular areas. Body condition is a really big one. We obviously want to calve our cows in decent condition, and we want to make sure they're not losing too much condition in those first couple months, so that they are in optimal condition to promote cycling so that they can get pregnant when breeding season starts. Poor pregnancy rate can also reflect the bull's fertility as well. So it's really important if you're doing natural service, which means you're putting a bull into the field, you're doing a breeding soundness exam on that bull before breeding starts to make sure that he's fit to do his job, and also be mindful of events that occur during breeding season or shortly beforehand, because those events can have an effect longer term on the bull fertility. So for example, if you have a really hot day at the very beginning of breeding season, just know if in a month or two, he might have poor fertility because that hot weather can affect sperm production. Okay, so those are just things to think about if you're struggling with a low pregnancy rate. You do some of these calculations and you're like, why is my pregnancy rate only 80% or something to that effect? These are some things you can look at to figure out where the issue actually is. Pregnancy loss is another one. It's going to reflect issues with stillbirths or spontaneous abortions that occur after cows become pregnant. A lot of these things are related to diseases. So vaccinating cows and making sure that everybody's up to date on those things can really help, kind of circumvent some of those issues. But we calculate pregnancy loss by subtracting the number of females that calve from the number of females that we confirm pregnant, divided by the total number of females confirmed pregnant. So it's a pretty straightforward calculation, but again, it can provide a lot of information in terms of, if there's an issue in this area, we know kind of what we need to look at. In terms of going back to kind of to like our calving season benchmark that we talked about in the last slide, the number of cows calving in the first 21 days of a calving season can be really informative for letting us know how fertile our cows are. So reflect this first one, if they're calving in the first 21 days of the calving season, it reflects first service conception rate, or how well she's cycling right at the beginning of calving season, because the estrus cycle is 21 days. If we look at the number of cows calving in the first 42 days of the calving season, that's going to reflect how many cows got pregnant on the first or second cycle. So how fertile they are in the beginning. And then we also want to look at the number of cows calving in that first 63 days of the calving season. And again, that's going to reflect our first, second, and third service conception rate. So ideally, we want more of our cows calving in the beginning, right? So in that first 21 or 42 days of the calving season, because again, that's going to indicate that our cows are fertile going into the calving season, and they're cycling right away, and they're ready to conceive right when they're put in with the bull. Switching gears, looking at some of our health benchmarks. These are going to be things that are reflecting potential issues related to health, nutrition management of cows, calves, heifers, etc. The first one we want to look at is calf death loss. Obviously, that's what it sounds like. It's the number of calves that die on a percentage basis. So you calculate that by taking the number of calves that die before weaning, subtract that from the number of calves born, and divide that by the number of calves born. So that's again going to be an indicator of calves that we're losing before they're actually weaned, before we can actually sell them. We also want to look at calf morbidity, which is basically the illness rate in our calves. So we generally will calculate that based on the number of calves that receive veterinary care or some sort of intervention, depending on how you record that on your farm. Subtract that from the total number of calves you have born, divided by the total number of calves. And then the last health benchmark we consider looking at is the body condition score of the cow at weaning. This isn't a presentation about body condition scoring, but there are a couple of key points we want to score our cows to make sure that they're in optimal condition. But condition score at weaning is really important because we want to make sure that our cow didn't lose too much in the beginning. She gained it back. If she lost some, she gained it back, and she's at a good condition score to go into her next calving. So that we don't have to, if we're, spring calving, we're not going to have to feed her to gain condition to prepare her for the next calving over the winter time. Some of our performance benchmarks are some of the things that come to mind when we say data collection and looking at the performance of our animals. Weaning age for our calves is one. It's the average number of days between birth and weaning, just as it sounds. Weaning weight is another one. So that's just taking a look at the weight of the calves at weaning. Weaning weight can reflect the calf growth potential, but also the cow milk production potential. So just keep that in mind, that it's not just the calf, it's also the cow as well. Average daily gain during that pre-weaning period is something that we all wish we had access to at all times, because that does reflect how well the growth rate of the calf, right, and how well it's growing. And we basically will calculate that by taking that weaning weight, subtracting out the birth weight, and dividing by the number of days, how old the calf is at weaning in days. So we get an average daily gain during that pre-weaning period in that way. Now, a lot of us don't have actual birth weights on our calves. We don't go out and measure birth weights when the calf is born. So because of that, there's another measurement that we can use. It's not quite as accurate, but it works just as well to reflect calf growth potential. But it's called weight per day of age. So we use this by taking the weight at weaning and divided by the age at weaning, and we get weight per day of age in that way. Again, it's still going to reflect calf growth potential. We assume when we use this estimate of weaning growth or pre-weaning growth, we are assuming that most of the calves are going to be similar in terms of their birth weight, right? And we know that's pretty true. For the most part, we have calves generally within, plus or minus 20 pounds or so at birth. And again, this is a really useful measurement that we can use if we don't have birth weights and we can only get weaning weights or something close to weaning or something like that. And then lastly, there's a couple of overall snapshot benchmarks that I like to use that reflect reproduction, health, and performance all together. So they don't indicate an issue in any particular area, but issues, poor performance in any of these areas can be reflective of different parts of the operation. So the first one is calf crop. Obviously, a cow calf producer, you're selling calves, right? That's your product. So basically, that's looking at the number of calves you wean divided by the number of females exposed for breeding. And again, exposed for breeding means that they were put in the field with the bull. You tried to breed them at some point. So that's how we calculate calf crop. The other big one is pounds of calf weaned per cow exposed. So that's the sum total of all the weaning weights of all the calves. You add up all the weaning weights. So you get total pounds of calf weaned divided by the number of females exposed for breeding. So where do we go from here? So I presented all these benchmarks. So I didn't present any targets for them. And the reason for that is that I'm going to show you here shortly, but there's targets that could be set for the industry wide, for across the industry. But again, you need to remember that it's going to vary from area to area what an appropriate target is going to be. The closest thing I have for national benchmarks is something called the Cow Herd Appraisal Performance Software, or CHAPS, that has been developed by the North Dakota State University. And they basically use data every year from cow-calf producers to generate targets for different benchmarks. So they utilize herd data from commercial cow-calf producers, and enrolled herds in this program are at least 50 cows, and so they have at least 50 cows, and they have to submit like 3 years of data to the program. And then they basically calculate annual benchmarks. So every year they come out with a new set of benchmarks that are based on the average of the previous 5 years. So for example, 2022 benchmarks, which I'm going to show you in the next slide, they're based on data that was collected or submitted between 2017 and 2021. And those data included data from over 52,000 cows. If you're interested in looking more at this information, I have the link listed on the slide there. But if you just Google CHAPS benchmarks cattle, it should come right up, and it should be pretty easy for you to get to at that point. So with that, I just want to show you what the benchmarks are from this program for the various different calculations that I've presented so far. So for our reproduction benchmarks, we have pregnancy rate, pregnancy loss, cows calving in the first 21, 42, and 63 days. And I have the target listed here on the right. So you can see for pregnancy rate, the target is 94%, right? That's not to say that if you're 92%, your herd is awful. That's just saying that for the herds that are enrolled in this program, the 5-year average was 94%. Pregnancy loss, less than 0.7% or so. Cows calving in the first 21 days. Ideally, you're seeing cows, about 2/3 of your animals calving in that first 21 days. That's indicating that they're very fertile when they go into that breeding season, which is what we want. And then obviously within that first 63 days, we want to have almost all of our animals calving at that point. Looking next to our health benchmarks. So we have calf death loss. We want to be losing, less than 3.5% of our calves, less if we can do that. And then cow condition score at weaning. I mentioned that as a big one. We want to shoot for our cows to be weaning calves and being at around a 6 in terms of body condition. So again, a body condition score of 1 to 9 is our scale. 1 thin, 9 is fat. A score of 6 is right in the middle there. And that's where we want our cows to be weaning our calves at. Weaning age, weaning weight, average daily gain and weight per day of age are our performance benchmarks listed here. You can see that weaning weight is listed here as a benchmark for performance. It's listed here at around 560 pounds. Just know that number can really vary depending on the breed that you have in your herd. The average daily gain, you can see here it's listed at 2.6 pounds per day as the target. Weight per day of age is a little bit higher because, again, we're not accounting for that initial birth weight in that calculation. But again, these are just, again, some ballpark numbers to get you started when you're thinking about collecting data and comparing your herd from year to year. And then lastly, weaning percentage and pounds of calf weaned per female exposed. We want to wean, 91% of our calves. That's kind of the goal. And we want to wean probably about 500 pounds of calf per cow that's exposed for breeding. So these are the targets that I present. And again, they can really help you get a good starting point and get a feel for what is a good number and what is kind of, a mediocre number. But again, as I'll show you here later, we need to be careful when we are using these targets. When we're tracking progress using benchmarks, it's always good to, start out by calculating your selected benchmarks each year, and then compare each year to the previous year and also the previous 5 years to get an idea of how you're progressing. And I will again reiterate that it's important to be cautious when comparing, one farm to another or to national benchmark standards, because every farm is different. Everyone has different circumstances and goals. Those CHAPS benchmarks were calculated from herds that are in the upper Midwest, which is quite different from here in our region. So just keep that in mind. But these standards can be really helpful in setting reasonable targets for your herd. So if you're at a 91% pregnancy rate, you're like, well, can I do a little better? How does that compare with the national average? So that can be helpful in that regard. But they should not be used to gauge success. So if you have a 90% pregnancy rate and you think that's awful, take a look at other parts of your herd. Maybe you are doing well. And at the end of the day, profitability is going to be your ultimate indicator of success, right? Your checkbook is going to tell you how successful you are. And then I pulled this quote from Bob Taylor at Colorado State. It states that profitable cattle are usually productive, but productive cattle are not always profitable. So what that means is you can meet all the gold standard benchmarks targets in the world, but still not be profitable. So that's just something to keep in mind, that you shouldn't break the bank trying to increase your pregnancy rate percentage by like 1%. It might not pencil for your operation. So that just keep that profitability in the back of your mind. So how do we get started? So if you are new to collecting data on your herd and you're not really sure where to start, I recommend making a list of benchmarks you want to use first. Say you just want to focus on a few of those reproductive benchmarks to get started, and just start little by little. It's also important when you make that list, determine how you're actually going to use these benchmarks to improve your herd's performance. So you don't want to be wasting your time collecting data that you're never going to use. So be mindful of what you're going to get out of these benchmarks before you get started and say that I'm going to collect all these weights and all these calves and then never use it, right? The next step is to determine what data you need in order to facilitate the calculations that you want. So for example, if you want to calculate average daily gain for your calves, you're going to need birth weights and you're going to need weaning weights for your calves. And that can be an issue sometimes for folks if you have facility, equipment, or labor constraints. So keep those things in mind. If you just want to calculate pregnancy rate, those are fairly, more reasonable things to calculate getting started, because those are based on numbers of animals that are exposed, number of animals that are confirmed pregnant, right? It's important to make a plan or a timeline for calculating and using the benchmarks, because that will keep you honest and keep you actually using. That kind of goes back to number one a little bit. It will keep you using that information that you are collecting and how you're actually going to use it. So if you're collecting all the weaning weights and you're not doing anything with that information until next year when you collect the weaning weights, that's not really doing anybody any good. You're not really getting a good use of your time and your data collection at that point. The next step is to start recording the data. And the important thing to remember is to use a system that works for you. If you hate computers, then use a pencil and paper. That's fine. Just make sure that it's legible and it's in a safe place that's not going to, get lost or, something to that effect. If you love computers, then by all means, write it on a piece of paper, put it in the computer, save it so you know that it's secure and it's not going to go anywhere. There are apps available. So on your phone, there's apps, there's all sorts of different things that you can tap into. So if you prefer those types of data recording options, then go for it. Whatever works for you is what is ultimately going to help you get the most out of your data collection. Track progress from year to year. That's really helpful. So say you're just getting started this year, you have no idea where you are. Get this year's data, write it down. Next year, when you collect your data, compare the two just to see where you are. And then, of course, it's always good to adjust your targets as you need, as you progress through your journey and using benchmarks. You know, you can make your own targets. You can use those national targets to set your own targets. So say your calving or your pregnancy rate's 80%, and you know the national standards 91 or 92%. Well, maybe for the next couple of years, you want to shoot to get to 83 or 84%, which is a more reasonable expectation rather than you jumping from 80% to 91%, you know, in a couple of years. That's a little bit less reasonable. And lastly, before I wrap up, I just want to briefly mention that we are working on creating a benchmark calculation tool that we're going to post on the website that you will be able to use. It's an Excel-based spreadsheet, but it's essentially you would put in your data in any box. It's labeled in yellow here on the left. And from that information, it will automatically calculate a whole host of different cow-calf benchmarks. And then the US targets are listed here on the right-hand side. And obviously, you know, those targets can change year to year, but this is just a tool that we're hoping to roll out in the next couple of months that will be useful to you as producers. And then going along with that, we also have a calf reporting sheet, data recording sheet that will has a bunch of information that you can enter as you wish, but it will help set you up to put those information into that last spreadsheet in order to calculate the benchmarks that you want to get. So with that, I'm going to wrap up, and if there are any questions, I'd be happy to take those. So thanks everybody for joining, and look forward to any questions. Thanks.